These are the best books that I read in 2024 across all different genres. I'm going to tell you what they are and why I think you should add them to your TBR for 2025. Let's get into it. Hi guys, if you are new to my channel, my name is Lydia Kyle and I am an avid reader who loves to share with you guys the books that I love. Typically, I share short form versions of this on my Instagram and TikTok and Facebook and Lemon8 platforms, which you can find in the description of this episode. But on YouTube, I'm going to start breaking it down in a little bit more detail. And so this is my first longer form video for my book content where I'm going to tell you all of the books that were my favorite across different genres in 2024 in hopes and convincing you to add them to your TBR for 2025. So let's jump right into it. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button, like this, and do me a favor by following my channel. The first category that I'm going to start with is young adult. I don't think that young adult books are getting enough recognition in the popular book reviewer sphere, like whether you're thinking about Book Talk or Bookstagram, like I feel like everything is very romance heavy right now, especially for female readers, but I love young adult fiction, specifically young adult fantasy. I love that. And I have read some really good, true young adult fantasy this year. But the best one that I read, I actually read it in December. So this is recent. This is a recent read for me. It's part of a trilogy. The first book is Half a King and it's written by Joe Abercrombie. This is a fantasy, but it feels more of like a coming of age story. There are some fantasy aspects to it, but not in the sense of like dragons and, you know, mythical creatures, not in that sense. It does have a Viking theme to it. So we're in kind of a Viking-esque society, and we have a coming of age story for a young king who goes on a very tumultuous and traumatic journey. And this book is true YA, meaning there's no content in this that I think is inappropriate for young readers. There is some detailed descriptions of things like slavery. There's some gore in there, but there's no intimacy or explicit content that I feel is out of touch for younger readers. So this is true young adult, in my opinion, because sometimes those lines are getting blurred currently. That's another discussion for another day. But as of right now, this is the best young adult that I read in 2024. So we got to give it up for Half a King by Joe Abercrombie. I will say I've read the second one also. I haven't finished the third. I'm very impressed with this author for writing young adult fantasy. Next, we have historical fiction. I know a lot of people would put The Women by Kristen Hanna into a women's fiction category. I don't think it's women's fiction. I think that Kristen Hanna writes stories that are complex enough and challenging enough and historically accurate enough that really a lot of her books should be put into the historical fiction category. That's just my opinion, but I'm putting this in historical fiction. And as far as historical fiction goes, Kristen Hanna wins the year for 2024. The Women is a story about the women who served in Vietnam. They were nurses in Vietnam. They served active duty, and a lot of Vietnam history ignores the women who served in Vietnam side by side with the men in active combat. And this book not only takes you to Vietnam and shows you the horrors that happened in Vietnam, but it also follows our main character, our main female character, back to the United States after the war and the treatment that she faced coming back from an active war zone, a extremely traumatic experience. She's coming home and her family is not as receptive to her service as she thought they would be. This story not only opened my eyes to the historical aspects of the Vietnam War, but it definitely ripped my heart out in a lot of ways. So historical fiction goes to The Women by Kristen Hanna. Okay, for women's fiction, 2024, the best read I had for women's fiction. Granted, I don't read a lot of women's fiction. I'll be transparent in that. I don't read a lot of women's fiction, but for me, the 2024 winner for women's fiction was Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus. And this, it was a journey. Emotionally, this was a journey, and I loved the female character in this. I think a lot of people have mixed opinions about the female main character in this book. To me, this female main character, I felt so connected to her. And the crazy thing about this book is that I really thought it was going to be a romance. Like, I thought it was going to be a women's fiction that leaned heavily on the romantic aspects of a woman's life. And that's kind of how it started. But all I'm going to tell you without spoilers is this is not a romance. This is not a romance. Romantic relationships are not the focus of this book. The focus of this book is women's rights in the 50s and 60s, motherhood, and women's place in the world of science. And that's not typically something that I would pick up and read, but this book took my breath away. And like I said, the female main character, she's probably one of my favorite female main characters in all of fiction. So women's fiction, I gotta give it to Lessons in Chemistry. My science fiction pick for 2024 is Red Rising. And I mean, the whole series, it's an unfinished series, but every single book in the Red Rising series, Red Rising was probably one of my most surprising likes of 2024. I had no idea how much I liked science fiction. I had no idea how captivating science fiction could be until I picked up this book at the recommendation of a friend. I would have never picked this up on my own. If you would have told me that I enjoyed reading science fiction at the beginning of 2024, I would have called you absolutely crazy. Not only is this the best science fiction that I read, this is the best book that I read in 2024 and my favorite series of all time as of right now. Red Rising by Pierce Brown takes the cake. I don't know how to put properly into words how entranced I am with this writing. The writing is beautiful. It's thought-provoking. The characters are challenging. They're not necessarily lovable, but they are incredibly... The depth of these characters blows my mind, and I don't want to gloss over that. As excited as I can get about books, I don't want to gloss over the depth of these characters. Pierce Brown writes characters that make you question everything that you think you know about them. Not only that, he writes characters in a way that makes you love them and hate them at the same time. And as an author, Pierce Brown is not afraid to take characters out of the story in very traumatic ways. This book, I cannot give it enough praise. I cannot give Red Rising by Pierce Brown enough praise. I don't think I've ever read anything that is more well-written, beautifully written, and thought-provoking as this. Best science fiction, best book of the entire year, Red Rising by Pierce Brown. Another genre that I don't read a lot of is psychological thrillers. Every once in a while, I will go on a kick where I pick up psychological thrillers and I enjoy them. They're just not necessarily something that usually reels me in and really challenges me as a reader. Gillian Flynn, Sharp Objects, best psychological fiction that I have read, psychological thriller that I have read in 2024, probably the best psychological thriller that I have read ever. This book is dark. This book is dealing with some very, very heavy topics, including mental illness and self-harm. And this book, not that it has a major plot twist, but it goes places that maybe you don't actually want to go as a reader, but at the end, you're left being thankful that we went there. I am so glad that I read this book. Also, I will say, a lot of people recognize Gillian Flynn's name because she wrote Gone Girl, which turned into like a major motion picture, right? But this was her first book. This was Gillian Flynn's debut novel. I had no idea when I picked it up. It was just recommended to me. And it's, as you can see, it's a very quick read. Very quick read. I think I probably could, if I didn't have kids and a life, I probably could have read this in one sitting. That's how drawn into this story that you get. And like I said, there's heavy topics such as family relationships, family trauma, toxic relationships, dangerous situations, self-harm, and some serious mental health issues. So go into this one knowing that there's some heavy real life stuff in this. The best romantasy that I read in 2024 was Quicksilver by Callie Hart. Now this is an out of print copy of this cover. So you may have seen the cover of Quicksilver. It has the male main character on the front of it. It looks very different. I am a collector of unique covers, out of print covers, and international covers. So that's why I have this copy instead. But this is Quicksilver by Callie Hart, and it is the best romantasy that I read in 2024, which is saying something because romantasy is like the hot ticket item right now in literature. But I will say that means there's a lot of romantasy that's being published that's really not good. And a really not good literature coming from well-known best-selling authors. There were a lot of major releases in the romantasy genre this year, and I was disappointed by a lot of them. This book and this author came out of nowhere for me. It was just recommended as a suggested read for me on Kindle Unlimited. I happened to download it because I didn't have anything pressing on my TBR at that time. I love this book. This book has good lore, good world building, good character development. It also has a female main character who's not just a badass. She's also dealing with things of like alchemy, science, and being lost in a world that she doesn't belong in. We have major plot twists towards the end. I was really unsure how the author was planning on turning this into a multi-book saga. Now at the end, I get it. I get it. And the romance in this is fantastic. The romance in this is very well done, but not overdone. It has just the right pace to it, and it's not to the point where you feel like that's the only thing that's carrying this story. This romance has a plot. This fantasy has good world building, and these characters absolutely belong where they are in my spot of best romantasy of 2024. I do not read a lot of nonfiction. I try to consume nonfiction fairly regularly because I feel like it's important. I do have a reading goal for 2025 to read at least 10 nonfiction books. This year I read several nonfiction books and I also listened to them on audio. And the best nonfiction that I read, this is a memoir by Yeonmi Park and it's called In Order to Live. And it is her story of escaping North Korea and her journey to freedom as a young girl. I was so tremendously educated by this book. There were times in this book where I felt ashamed of how little I knew about North Korea. Obviously, we hear North Korea as kind of a buzzword, a topic. We know that it's not a great place to live. We know that they do some really questionable things. Hearing it from a first-person account changed my entire perception of North Korea. And I really am thankful that I picked up this book because I not only felt educated, I felt humbled, and I also felt like I had a much better worldview after reading this book. This memoir by Yeonmi Park is a must read for everyone. I really truly believe that everyone, regardless of your knowledge of world politics, international affairs, I really encourage you to read In Order to Live. And that's why it's my best nonfiction of 2024. Last but not least, we have my favorite picks for fantasy. Fantasy is my comfort genre. I love fantasy books. It's my go-to. It is my go-to. Granted, I will say, as I've gotten older, I think I've diversified. I feel like this video definitely showcases that I've diversified my reading, but fantasy is what really brought me into reading as a young person, and it has sustained me through all seasons of my life. I can always count on fantasy to help me just escape my life when I need to, because we all need to escape our lives sometimes. There's nothing wrong with a little bit of disassociation when you're diving into literature. Fantasy, though, is what I always come back to, and I couldn't choose one because these two books are so wildly different from each other, but both equally deserving. So first I have Empire of the Damned, which is book 2 in the Empire of the Vampire. You can see the first book up there. Empire of the Vampire by J. Kristoff. Empire of the Damned, we waited a long time for this one. It was well worth the wait. I love J. Kristoff's world building. I love his storytelling. I love the way he incorporates religion and almost kind of like religious archaeology. Like you feel like you're going back in time, but it's like, wait, this is fantasy. Like, this is a fantasy world. This didn't actually happen, but it just feels so real. It feels like it could be real. And I love the characters. I love these characters. I love that J. Kristoff is not afraid to do really, really questionable things with his characters' lives. I am obsessed with the characters that he has kept, and I'm also devastated by the characters that he has taken away. J. Kristoff's storytelling, it is top tier. The dialogue is witty and well placed. The character development is not always what you think it should be, but these characters have so much depth. This isn't a happy ending, and I appreciate that. And this book really, really sucks you in and doesn't let you go until the very end. And then the very end, you're left wanting more. I cannot wait for the third and final installment of this trilogy. But one of the best fantasies, fantasy number 1 for 2024 was Empire of the Damned by J. Kristoff. The second fantasy that is getting my best of 2024 is Priory of the Orange Tree. This book, a lot of people are scared to read this book. It's a solid 800 pages, but do not let this book deter you from reading it. This is true high fantasy. There's high fantasy and there's low fantasy. Low fantasy would be something like Fourth Wing, right? That's a romantasy, low fantasy. It's just not quite there when it comes to the world building, in my opinion. Still really fun to read, really enjoyable, great characters, great love story, yada, yada. This is high fantasy. High fantasy is all about the world building. You are transported into a different place, a different time, and you have no idea what you're doing there until the author breaks it down for you. This book has dragons. This book has kings and queens. This book has warrior monks. This has women who are total badasses in every single way. This is a very female-oriented story. The main characters are mostly female, and the focus is on the female main characters. There is some romance in this, but I would not say that it's the reason for this book. Romance is a part of this plot. It's not the plot. The plot is the world building and the political espionage, the religious aspect. There's so much going on in this book. It is definitely worth the read, and don't be intimidated by its side, because Priory of the Orange Tree is a fantastic read, and that's why it is my second best fantasy for 2024. Thanks for watching my reading recap for 2024, you guys. I really appreciate you subscribing to my YouTube channel. I am a new YouTuber. I'm learning how to do this. I am diving in head first with all the gusto, and I really appreciate that you guys are willing to go on this journey with me and be here. So thank you for hitting the subscribe. Thank you for watching, and if you feel so inclined, give a thumbs up, drop a comment, let me know if you added any of these books to your reading list for next year.